So now, as we have some basic understanding of clustering domain, we can move further ahead in its detail. So in order to achieve clustering, we have basically two different set of measures. One is a similarity measure and other is a dissimilarity measure. So we can use these two measures in order to form clustering. One measure is basically looking the similarity in the data, or the other one can look into the dissimilarity present in the data. The measure reflects the degree of closeness or separation of the target objects and should correspond to the characteristics that are believed to distinguish the clusters embedded in the data. So the similarity measure is the degree to which a pair of objects are alike, right? So we basically are trying to figure out that if we have a pair of objects, then how much they are alike, or how much resemblance is present in their characteristics or properties. Concerning structural patterns represented as strings or sequences of symbols, the concept of pattern resemblance has typically been viewed from three main perspectives. So what are those three main perspectives? Are number one, similarity as matching, according to which patterns are seen as different viewpoints, possible instantiations or noisy versions of the same object. Similarly, structural resemblance based on the similarity of their composition rules and primitives, and the third one, that the third similarity can be on the basis of contents, right? So we can use the contents based similarity in order to find the similar structural patterns of different objects. So as we discussed also in the previous lecture, that we have basically 5 different kinds of similarity measures which we can use in order to find the similarities between different objects. And out of these 5 similarity measures, we basically use 3 most commonly used measures. One is the Euclidean distance measure, another is the Manhattan distance measure, and third is the cosine distance measure. So these three are the most commonly used distance measures. Also, sometimes people also used Tanimoto distance measure, but this one and the squared Euclidean distance measure, both of these measures are not being frequently used, as we have these three measures. So mainly we will be looking at these three distance measures mainly in these lectures. So how do we measure similarity? Give examples of similarity measures. Similarity is subjective, number one thing. Number two, it measures therefore depend on the data, right? The use case or the different users, if it belongs to different set of users. In practice, it is not always straightforward which matrix works well, then try and error can be followed, right? So we have looked 5 different distance measures on matrix. So we cannot say specifically that which distance measure will perfectly work for which kind of data set. So we can have a hit and trial rule, and we can check different similarity measures and on the basis of these similarity measures we can see that which measure is basically working for what kind of data set, and then we can use that data set. Examples of similarity measure, as I have shown you earlier, are Euclidean distance, Manhattan, and cosine. So these three are the most commonly used distance measures. So now in k-means clustering specifically, if we talk about the k-means clustering, the target is the same which we have common in any clustering algorithm. So we have a total population here, or we have a set of samples here, right? And out of these total population of sample, we try to make different groups or cluster. So these can be 4 groups, 5 groups, depending upon the input data set. So the process by which objects are classified into a number of groups so that they are as much dissimilar as possible from one group to another group, but as much similar as possible within the group, right? So this is basically the interclass similarity and intra-class similarity which we discussed in the earlier slides. The target is to have as much as maximum similarity within each group, but maximum dissimilarity from one group to another group. The objects in group 1 should be as similar as possible, this one, these objects should be closely related to each other, but there should be much difference between an object in group 1 and group 2. So if we talk about these two groups, which is group 1 and which is this one is group 2, so the target is to have the instances or data samples which have maximum difference between one group to another group, but minimum difference within the group. The attributes of the objects are allowed to determine which objects should be grouped together, and this grouping of the objects will be based on their attributes or characteristics. So now let's have a overview of the main algorithm of the k-means clustering, which is a fairly simple algorithm. So it usually works with the numeric data only, right? So when you have a problem in which you have numeric data set, then you can use k-means clustering and you can hope that it will work perfectly for numerical data. The number one step is to pick a number. So we basically select a number k, which acts as a cluster centers, and usually we choose this number as a random number, right? Similar to previous algorithms in which we were having some initial population and those initial populations were being selected as randoms. Then we assign every item to its nearest cluster center, for example, by using Euclidean distance. So number two step is that we need to assign each item or data point to its nearest cluster center, right, which we have initialized here. So how do we calculate this nearest thing? We can calculate the Euclidean distance between this item and the cluster center, and if we have this minimum distance to any cluster center, then we will assign this item to that cluster center. Number 3 point is to move each cluster center to the mean of the assigned items. So the third point is to move the cluster center as close to as possible to the mean or average of the assigned items. Number 4 point is that we need to repeat these steps, step number 2 and step number 3, in which we are calculating that distance and then we are basically updating the cluster center, and we need to repeat these steps until we have some convergence, right? So convergence means here is that the change in cluster assignments less than a threshold. So we select a threshold, and if we see that the change in the cluster center is less than that threshold, then we can stop our algorithm. So basically this is acting as a stopping criteria for our k-means clustering algorithm. Here is the flow chart of the k-means clustering algorithm, which I just explained. So what we are doing here is that we are starting with an initial number of clusters, right? So we have a value of k, which is acting as the total number of clusters which our algorithm will be creating. Then we basically calculate the centroid of that cluster, which is also called sometimes as the cluster center. Then we calculate the distance, and this distance is basically the distance between an item or data sample to the cluster center, and then based on the minimum distance we are basically doing the grouping, and we are repeating these steps until we reach to a convergence, right? And what the convergence is when we have the change in the centers minimum to a threshold, then we can say that we have achieved the convergence. So we can say that we need to iterate until we reach to a stable state or convergent state, and here we are doing 3 steps. Number 1, we need to determine the centroid, then we need to calculate the distance, and based on the minimum distance we are assigning the item to the cluster center. So these are basically the main basic steps of a simple k-means algorithm. So let's have another look at its algorithm. So let's suppose we have given a cluster number k, right? So if I want to make 3 clusters, then I can set this value as 3. The k-means algorithm is carried out in 3 simple steps. So after initialization we are basically following 3 steps. Number 1 step is that we are assigning each object or item to the cluster of the nearest seed point. Seed point here is the cluster center, measured with a specific distance metric, and this distance metric, you know, is can be a Manhattan distance, Euclidean distance. Now once we have the distance measure, we can compute new seed points, so new cluster centers, as the centroids of the clusters of the current partition. This is basically the calculation of the mean of the cluster centers or centroids, and then we are basically repeating these two steps until we reach to convergence.